During today's event, we'll learn about effectively leveraging advisors, including a board, when scaling up your business. Today, we're joined by a panel of BC Tech board members, past and present, to learn how you can leverage these important resources to help fuel your growth.
We have an esteemed panel here, an investment banker, a lawyer, and an investor, all of whom have been advisors in their own right, in past and present, and have worked with advisors past and present, and a variety of staged companies. So they have a lot of knowledge and experience to share. So I thought we should start off discussing what are the different types of advisors that a company can use. There's obviously scientific advisory type advisors. There's the board itself that has a variety of types of advisors, whether it's domain or functional, for example, or strategic. There's customer advisors, all sorts. So I thought maybe, Cam, we'd start with your perspective on the different types.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you for the setup. Having been an operator, an entrepreneur, I was always on the lookout for good advisors. And typically I was trying to find people who could help me open doors and help me raise money. And there was a real sort of intent with it. And I think that's often the case with scaling up companies, and depending on the makeup of your board and advisory groups. But what I found is once you have some capital, I found that my needs were really more on the operational side, your functional advisors, if you will. And I think that's something I hear across the tech ecosystem now, is that talent is at such a premium, especially experienced talent. It can be really helpful and really beneficial to have that fractional perspective in terms of your advisors, people who have looked at what scale means every day, and that's beyond the capital and the tech, often in the talent, but there's a really powerful legal component. There's a great, tax and incentives component. There is, IP and all, banking and capital raising. All of those things might be the biggest fire on a given day you need to put out. And I really recommend, and I recommend all the time to companies that I'm speaking with, that they take advantage of that talent, because people more and more are looking to be fractional advisors. They enjoy that and giving back, and it's very helpful as you scale.
Thanks. Rich, do you have anything to add there?
I guess the only thing I'd say, just kind of building on Cam's point, is, the world is awash in, money, advisors. I think there's a tendency to think that you need to hire full-time people who may or may not be specialists, and oftentimes are generalists. And I think, taking advantage, it's like the gig economy or the fractional economy, taking advantage of people who are subject matter experts for that sliver of time that you can, is a much better way to accelerate, not always, but often much better way to accelerate, whether it's market insights, as we talked about, the different heuristics, scientific insights, access to capital, what have you. So I think it's a luxury that we have maybe in some ways now, and especially with much more stuff being done virtually, you can kind of assemble and reassemble very quickly. I think we're going to talk about later kind of how the other half of the equation being, how do we ensure responsibilities and roles are clear and well defined, which is where I see a lot of those relationships go sideways. But I think, the comment around the availability and the benefit is spot
on. Justin?
Yeah, no, I think just to add to that, the one category that I tuck in today's climate, especially at the early stage, I know we're going to talk about advisors at different stages, but at the early stage, how do you source advisors? And one category I'd say, looking at accelerators or other programming like YC or CDL or Techstars, those can often, you don't necessarily think about those as advisors, but they're a great pipeline and funnel for high quality advisors typically. And you also get a lot of network effect from being parts of those groups. So in a sense, they play an advisory function. And I think, Rich and Cam, we talked a bit about this. It's hard to know which advisors, and we'll talk about that, I think, as we go through here, but and it may be hard to find advisors if you're not part of a network, but that's a good source too when you look at something like an accelerator to make sure you're plugging into people that have, as Rich said, the expertise you actually need.
Yeah, so following on that point, Justin, can you elaborate a bit on sort of what type of advisor for maybe what stage of company or other factors to look at? Like maybe you're considering a partnership or a strategic partnership, and maybe you need a certain kind of advisor, or you're an early stage, concept stage company, maybe you need a different kind of advisor. Can you elaborate a bit more? And it'd be great to hear some examples from all of the panelists.
Yeah, sure, Maria. So I think what we see a lot when we work with early stage companies is a focus on accumulating advisors, sometimes actually designed to help improve your public profile of your business. So we get a lot of slide decks and early pitches where you have a slide of advisors, and it's almost like building the resume of the team, and that can be effective. I think it's much more important that you're actually picking advisors early that add functional, like that are useful and that are going to improve your business, not just make it look like you've got a team of people behind you. But early on, I think in the old days we used to see a real focus on boards of advisors, and startups would say, I need sort of a board of advisors because I'm too early for a functional board. And I haven't seen that be overly successful. So early on, what I'd say is like finding individuals who will actually be engaged and who will provide the type of advice you need at the time based on your stage of development. So I do think it's important as an early entrepreneur to find individuals who will commit some real time and energy to support you through what you're dealing with at that particular period of time. That can be hard to do, but again, you get through the right accelerators. That's a good access point to find people that are going to be useful. I do think, and this is going to sound very self-serving, so I should have let Richard Cam say this, but you also need to make sure you have professional advisory early. And it doesn't have to, accounting and law sound boring and maybe not super useful, but what I can tell you, and Rich and Cam have both been investors, if you don't get your IP right and you don't get your cap table right, you can, before you get out of the gates, end up with an unfundable company for reasons that you're not expected to know as a startup CEO. So I think even getting professional services advisors early is important. And it doesn't have to cost you much money if you do it properly. But so I think, individual business advisors, professional services, I would get right from pre-incorporation. And then I would start to look at layering in more, a bigger team of advisors as you have functional need. The board, just the last thing I'll say on that, people think about a board, I find today, as something that is often just the founders until you raise capital, and it doesn't really serve any purpose. And then you raise capital and your investors want a board seat. And so startups start adding investor board seats. And once you're into growth stage, you obviously at that point typically end up with several investor reps, and you add independence and you have a reduced founder participation. And that can be very important as you grow and accelerate your business. But what I've seen very successful companies do is actually bring on actual board members earlier in the life cycle before the capital raising event requires you to do it. And what I think is really important, in part because of the difference, boards have a completely different stature than all the other categories we're talking about, right? They're fiduciaries who have legal obligations to act in the best interests of the company. That includes your shareholders and others in the business. They have to have, by virtue of their obligations, a relatively high engagement. And there are going to be people who, if you can find the right people to sit on your board, can be tremendously valuable. I think about it as an arrow in the quiver of a startup sort of resource that many times founders don't realize they ought to use until they're forced to. And I think that's an underrepresented asset that really, if you can go out early and for relatively modest compensation, find an actual board member to bring on as a founder, you'll set yourself up for success as you head into your institutional finance and your growth stage. So I think that's one that you should start earlier than most people think.
That's good advice. I would agree with that. Others, Cam or Rich?
Yeah, I really resonate with what Justin said. I mean, my experience was as an operator was that I always getting good advisors was something I always felt I would do once I made a raise, got that raise done or I had matured. Meanwhile, it was priority number 50 on things I wanted to spend money on at my own expense. And I think, there's nothing worse than bad advice. And that can be as simple as starting with, who's doing your shred, who's doing, you touched on what space are you in and what's the right advisor at the right time. Well, if you're a fintech payment or a payments platform, you should understand data security and have some perspective around things that really matter. You might not think you can afford the full-time equivalent, but there's lots of people. And what blew my mind when I went to the advisory side at PwC was I was talking to a tax partner, but that tax partner had seen every scale-up company in DC in the past 20 years and was an incredible business advisor. They might not be great at branding themselves as a scale-up partner for a fintech company, but advisors have seen a lot of similar models, and the lessons learned can become invaluable. And what I'm seeing now is that on the capital market side, there's all types of capital available, and the compression between rounds is something that companies are raising a lot of money earlier and faster than they have before, and getting your go-to-market strategy right is really what comes next after that. And that's where advisors can be super helpful at saying, look, if you're putting together a partnership agreement or reseller agreements, these are things you need to look for, or you're not going to close that deal, which is critical to your getting that raise done, unless you figure out your data security strategy, and therefore you need some good advice. So understanding what you need. I wish I'd taken advantage of advisory firms. And I'll give Justin and the law firms credit. They were the first to really jump in and help me with really favorable terms. And what I thought was going to be prohibitively expensive really wasn't. So don't hesitate to call the best people you can find and get advice, because you'd be surprised how often they're willing to help.
Let me say a couple of sort of what sound like cynical things, but just maybe that's my nature. And Maria, I mean, you're an experienced investor. She may have some, valuable insights here too. So I invite you to chip in. But if I've done, I don't know, say 90, 95 deals in my career, kind of seed stage to growth, the number of times I've invested because of an advisory board is exactly zero. Never. So it's an indirect signal, I think, to build on what Cam and Justin were saying, which is like, your ability to secure and source, and there's even a comment in the chat, those advisors is a signal about what you're like as a salesperson, right? It's no different than fundraising in general. Like, a lot of these discussions and forums become, well, how do I raise money? Well, the truth is, if you're selling a product, if you're selling equity in your company, if you're selling an advisory board position, it's all a reflection of how good you are at telling a story and attracting people to follow you. So I think your ability to get a board should be a signal, but it should really only be viewed as a tool to help you, not as a tool to get money. There's so much money out there now. The advisory board should not be a mechanism, a needed mechanism to get there. That would be one thing. The other thing I would say is a junior advisor, and I'll just say, let's say perhaps somebody who's been, in a certain career vertical for a while, will have more time potentially, but will of course have less access and experience. A more senior person will have more experience and access, but oftentimes, in my experience, their reputation and their time mitigates their value. So you could have the ex-CMO of Goldman Sachs sitting on your advisory board as an example. They're not going to take much chances by introducing you or your network or your product or your company to people, that are say an order of a degree of separation away from them. So you want to be careful that you're not just getting names that then don't actually extend themselves, and you don't want to get people who are too junior who don't actually have the access. So just be very mindful, and it's well within your rights as an entrepreneur to really push people, and I guess we'll talk about that in a minute, on what they think and what they sign up to deliver for you, because general availability and time is not worth paying much for, in my view.
Yeah, I would agree, Rich, that all makes a lot of sense. And I would say, in my experience has been similar. I can't recall that I've ever invested because there's a certain advisor involved. It does lend some, I guess, comfort in that they've gone out to seek help. And we always want to work with entrepreneurs that are looking to learn and want some counsel. Just thinking about two examples where I've seen advisors work effectively is, a customer like a KOL type of, key opinion leader advisor that really helps you gain credibility with your customers. That actually can make an impact. And then what Cam was referring to before, kind of that fractional advisor that then actually might become a full-time employee. So fractional CMO, I'm seeing quite a bit these days because it's that role is quite expensive. And depending the stage of company, you don't necessarily need a full-time CMO. And so that, to me, as an investor, would indicate your ability to attract great talent, which I think is a great attribute that we want to see in entrepreneurs. But Rich, let's move on to, I think, kind of the meat here. So, you're looking to engage an advisor. I think a good framework you laid out was what are the roles, responsibilities, and of course, remuneration, which really can vary. It'd be great to hear about how you think about that.
I was getting confused. Is it remuneration or remuneration? I think it's remuneration.
Yes.
Dustin would probably know.
Yes.
Remuneration.
Yeah. So again, if it's helpful to folks out there, there's actually, so those are the 3 R's. There's the role, the responsibilities, remuneration. And then there's the 4th R, which I kind of put in the bucket of restrictions. So, let's just take each in turn. So the role, I think, there's clearly the title and, are they a member of your board, which I think, Justin, Cam have touched on. Are they a member of a customer advisory board? Are they a member of an informal ad hoc advisory committee? And I think it's important to understand the differences between all those, which I won't go into, but understanding where they're going to sit. And ultimately, there's a much higher materiality threshold if they're advising the board, let's say, as an example, versus management. And I think it's important you understand which group they're ultimately responsible and accountable to, because that will drive different kinds of behavior and feedback. So that's kind of on the role. And also is it a functional role? Are you expecting them to opine just on one particular thing? Is it general guidance? I think there's a tendency for a lot of early stage startups to hire people because they think they can, kind of help introduce them to money, which again, I think we've touched on, but I'd be very, very careful of that. The liquidity in the markets now is, you should be able to navigate to capital sources without, real strong or real heavy involvement from third parties. At the earliest stages is what I'm talking about. I think as you get later, people like Cam and others are, more than helpful. But so that's on the role. The responsibilities, what are they going to be doing? How often are they going to be doing it? Is a hour a week, hour a month, 3 hours, a day a week? And I think as you kind of map those things out, understanding if the value, which is the third point around remuneration, is that in line with the time that they're prepared to spend. Now, you might say some people have, the ability to call a Rolodex out and, add value on a few minutes. Generally speaking, it is actually, in my opinion, a more direct relationship. The more time, the more value. So on the remuneration, this is where a lot of people get, I think, really hung up on is, what's an advisor? What should they be paid? And my rule of thumb is figure out what's a fair annual salary. Is it $50,000, $100,000, $500,000, $1 million, $5 million for that kind of person? And then back into what would be a fair compensation for them for the amount of time. So if they're going to spend a day a week and they're a, whatever, I'll let you do the math, but the 1 day a week then should be split roughly 1/3 to 2/3 on a cash basis and 1/3 to 2/3 on an equity basis. Now, keep in mind, you might say, well, I don't have a lot of money, so I got to pay them in equity. That equity, if you do things right, is going to be worth 10 times the cash you would have paid them. So be very, very judicious about who you're giving equity to. And really, they should be at risk for a good portion of that equity. So always be putting them on a vesting schedule. Don't give them all their equity up front, whether it's a quarterly vest, a yearly vest, a monthly vest, whatever you decide, such that if you decide they're not carrying their weight you sever the relationship and they don't get all that stock that you've, notionally agreed to. That's really, really important. And then the last thing on the restrictions, NDAs, who else are they advising to? You should not, in my opinion, again, be having them have direct contacts with anybody, whether it's customers, investors, advisors, without you. They're in service and support of you, not going out and representing your organization to others. So those would be the 4. I'll stop there.
All right. Cam, Justin, any thoughts on the 4 R's?
No, I think Rich summed it up for me really succinctly. I think there's the cash to equity piece. It seems to be the crux of it often, and the time and clear expectations of what is most critical. How can you add value, and making sure these don't after 3 weeks take a turn for the worse, where unmet expectations turn into something that doesn't work for either side. Because it's, these ecosystems are small, and you want to make sure, good advisors become an incredibly effective source of talent, of doors that open, not, all over the place, and treating them appropriately as well is, I saw when I went to the advisory side, how often tech entrepreneurs, and I put myself in that company, would grind, really talented people to sort of give their services for free in a way they wouldn't do themselves. So I think it's often, so make sure you when you're working with advisors, you select appropriately, you set appropriate expectations, but also recognize that their time, this is their careers as well. And that, you're fair to them the other way. It's not just sort of advisors who are hoping to glom on like a barnacle to the side of a scaling tech company. This is often, they're not even going to tell you how much they're giving because they want to see you grow and scale, and they have a vested interest in it, maybe financially, but also they're cheerleaders. And I learned that along the way, that advisors are some, I think they kind of go under recognized. If you look at all these scale ups, these successes in BC tech, there's a really core group of advisors that are a critical component of our tech ecosystem. And I think it sometimes goes unrecognized. So just be mindful of their time as well.
Yeah, and I agree entirely with what you said, and I think there is a distinction between mentorship and advisors as well that you have to be mindful of. And I think there's a lot of great mentors in the ecosystem who, frankly, might be willing to do it for free, and that's what really a mentor is, right? Is someone who's just part of your journey, but is giving you advice, typically because of a personal connection. But if you start treating a mentor like an advisor, or the expectations are advisory, then you do have to think about, the right compensation, and you'll end up getting kind of what you pay for. Having said that, what Rich said, I think is 100% true. You're going to have some false starts. So you really have to make sure, especially when you're using equity, that you've put the right parameters around it, that it vests on an appropriate timetable, that the quantum of equity is appropriate. If you plan to be a venture scale business, your stock option compensation, while it feels cheap to many founders initially compared to cash, every percent that you give away is dilution you're going to suffer at your next round or the round after that. And it can, not only can you overpay advisors, but you can actually, impede your ability the equity to bring on, C-suite folks or employees, and you've given it to advisors. That can really hurt. And I think there's often a power imbalance at the beginning of the startup cycle where senior folks will say, well, this is this is what you should give me in equity. And if you're not doing your homework and you don't know if that's reasonable, you sort of go along with it. But putting the parameters around it and documenting it is totally reasonable. And there's nothing wrong with an actual advisory agreement. And I think people should be willing to agree to, actual terms in a document that, to Rich's point with the 3 or 4 R's, those should be written down somewhere and communicated so that, it's clear to everybody.
Great. Any examples that you guys have seen of what not to do with regards to the R's?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe I'll just start. I have seen a lot of startups overcompensate on the equity side early, and they'll give away 1% of their business or 2% of their business to somebody without any real understanding of what the actual inputs are going to be from that individual, and it's undocumented. Maybe it's under a stock option plan, maybe not. But there's very little regard for how that's going to wind up, and then you end up with one or two advisors cannibalizing the equity pool and really not having time to give or being value added. So I won't name specific examples, but I see that a lot, Maria. Like that to me is probably the biggest risk at the early stage. So I think you have to be very careful and judicious about how you use equity. And if anything, paying probably too much cash is a better risk to take, because frankly, you can turn off the tap pretty quickly on the cash side. You can't necessarily do that on the equity side. But also good advisors will be honest with you, and they'll explain sort of the risks of the relationship on the other side too. That's my experience. So that's the big risk.
I have one example, Maria, from my first business. I was doing a lot of work in New York. I was in my 20s. I knew what I knew, but I also knew that I needed some help from some senior people, and I identified this senior, someone that it was giving me some great advice, a very senior financial person in New York. And I was kind of awed by his experience and his perspective, and thought, amazing if I can get this person to care about my business. And he's like, I'll come on your board and I'll chair your board. And I thought my problems are solved. And it was a total nightmare because he didn't really understand what we were doing. He thought he was sort of Yoda on the board, who's just going to give wisdom and wait for us to change our strategy to his opinion. And it took me about 1.5 years to extricate him from the board. And he did some damage to other, financing relationship. It was just, it ate so much of my brain for a long time. And I could have got the same advice from him without putting him on the board. And he would have looked good as well, because he was affiliated with a rapidly scaling tech company and win-win, but he wanted this position and I felt that he deserved, I didn't know. And I was intimidated by the experience. So I also think, don't be arrogant, but also know those positions are really meaningful, especially in a governance space, and don't give them away if you don't need to. So I learned my lesson.
Yeah, I think that's a good tangible example. I would go one step further and say, unless somebody's paying for equity, I wouldn't consider giving them equity unless you've got a relationship with them that goes back further than 1 year. And unless you've kind of built a personal connection, you understand what kind of person, you've reference checked them, you understand kind of what they do for a living and who they've done it with, and a little bit, everybody's got, skeletons in the closet, but you understand a bit more. It's just too important. And you can run into the problems that Cam's describing. The other thing I've seen that people don't do that maybe they should do more of is a skills matrix. So being thoughtful ahead of time before you engage on a fundraising or I saw that comment in the chat, where do we find advisors? Well, the answer to that is, what kind of advisors? What are you looking for? And if you sit back and you say, okay, my CAB, my Customer Advisory Board is going to have this profile, and my SAB, my scientific is going to have this, and my board's going to have this. And of course, there's give and take on my board from an investment if I'm doing an institutional round or what have you. When you map all that out and you step back and you say, okay, and by the way, it takes time and energy to manage all these. So you want to be thoughtful about how many people. But if the end product of all that calculation is I need individuals with these kinds of skills, then you can be much more targeted on an outreach. And again, it should be initiated by you searching and selling versus them searching and selling you on why they should be involved.
Yeah, absolutely. That last point being particularly important, I think. There's actually a question here in the chat, which is pertinent to the compensation question. So for any of the panelists, would you recommend that everyone kind of gets the same percentage of equity, or is it based on the individual and their contribution? Thoughts?
I think it's individually based. I mean, the concept of an advisor is just, it doesn't really have its own content until you give it content. So I think it's not like saying we're going to have a matrix and every junior developer is going to get this much, and every sales person is going to get this much. Like it's not an employee matrix where you're filling roles that are clearly well defined and understood. I think it's hard to say what an advisor is going to bring to the table. What we've talked about here is, a variety of different types. And in fact, I'd be a little bit worried if you had enough advisors you were comping with equity to even worry about that question, because it starts to sound to me like, you're getting to the point where if you're comping a whole bunch of advisors, I think you're probably giving away too much equity. If what you're really talking about is some of the fractional work that Cam, I think, mentioned, that's a little bit different, right? So if you're using people in operational roles, and we're talking about those as advisors, but really they're fractional, and whatever, CMO or CFO or whatever, that is more understandable to me. But just general advisory, I'd be cautious if you have more than a few.
One thing, Maria, I just wanted to jump back to just quickly to a previous point. I was just thinking through something that I've seen. Actually, I think you want to be mindful of is not having a bait and switch with your advisors. Like if you really want people to come on to help you raise money, let them know. And I've been through this. I'm sure you guys have as well, where you're helping a company and it's clear the expectation quickly is, help me with this raise, and it becomes a drag. To be honest, it's like that's fine if you go into it eyes wide open, but if that's the only benefit you provide, just be clear on those expectations. And the other thing is be mindful of those people's reputation. If you're on a deck and you're using your advisors to open doors as well, and you're not clear with them on that, you're leveraging their reputations for other purposes, like just the communication there, because that's when I can see things go sour quickly if you're not mindful of their reputations.
Yeah, and Cam, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can count on one hand the number of companies that compensated an individual, so not a firm, like an individual in a seed stage, capital raise, who successfully paid an advisor with an equity comp model, like a success fee model. It's just not, it's completely different than hiring a banker or a capital raising institution that's going to go out and actually have a methodical approach with, a market assessment and a network. But hiring an individual, what you're going to get is that person's network. And you got to understand what that is. It might be other high net worth individuals in your local geography. It could be a bunch of dentists, like no offense to dentists, right? But like, I think that's just not the model. Like if that's a very high risk model. And so really the people who are going to bring network to syndicate deals probably aren't doing it for money. So they might be investors who want other co-invests that are strong and they want your business to succeed, but they're not going to ask to get compensated for that until you need someone like a Cam to come in and do an actual round, and that's a different story.
Can I take the next question in the chat? I mean, I think you're hearing the same thing from all of us around the customization and the, being careful around the equity. To Brian's question, I mean, I think it's, my view, it would be just what you think that person deserves and requires, totally customized. And I think the FAST agreements are a good starting point, but Justin and others would have, I'm sure, templates of the wazoo for those things. On the last one though, I think that's a really interesting question, because, and maybe my perspective as a former corporate investor, right, in which often we were a customer and we were on the board and we'd made the investment in part because of the hoped for strategic value, bidirectionally. So, in my experience, it's helpful to perhaps to think about the heuristic. What do I get as a investor / shareholder in terms of governance rights, which are, again, people like Justin and Cam and Maria can explain those things at length to you. What's traditional, what's typical, what's fair, all that stuff. As long as those don't bleed into the role of the customer. So in other words, as long as the customer is not exerting the customer, when he's wearing he or she is wearing the customer hat, exerting undue influence on the company as a shareholder and saying, you should not do this. We're not going to devote capital to that. We're not going to build that product because it's going to be directed to some other customer, potentially competitive. Then I think the concerns are less. And what we used to do is to really try and ensure that the director on the board was clear, oftentimes it was the ventures team, about their fiduciary obligations, which was to improve shareholder value, which generally means get as many customers, competitive or not, as you possibly can. It's when you have less experienced directors who are perhaps, and certainly we did see this occasionally, a president of a business unit who doesn't really care about how the company does, but wants to ensure their supplier relationship stays intact, that's when you have problems. So it's really a function of where that person sits in the organization, how much experience do they have as a director, what their motivations are they open and honest about it? So it can be great because you get right from the horse's mouth, but it can be actually quite terrible if they don't kind of respect those boundaries.
Cam, did you have customers involved? No.
No, I was careful on that after making many mistakes at the beginning.
And I have found, think about how you want to engage and get your customer feedback, because there's other ways to do it. As I mentioned, you get a customer advisory board, and so they don't have that level of fiduciary and what have you. So, think about other ways first, perhaps, unless, of course, they're a strategic investor, then you might not, you have to think about other things.
Maria, I had a question, actually, and maybe for you and Rich. Sometimes you're brought on, you invest, or you're brought on at a certain stage as an advisor or to a company, investor or advisor. And then that role, I see this a lot now there is a lot of capital out there, and a lot of VCs are saying, we're more than capital, right? We can help you scale. Or we can help you grow and help you evolve. Do you, and not trying to put you on the spot here at all, Marie, but do you see that role changing from an investor to, is there pressure to operate? And should entrepreneurs have expectations that advisors will evolve as your business evolves as well?
You want me to go first, Rich? So yeah, especially given the stage we invest, it is all about scaling. So it depends what aspect of the scaling in many ways. I think there is an expectation to get more kind of operationally involved. The way our approach, for example, often the scaling is around people. And making some decisions around that, and not just searching for the people and finding people, but how do you what's the right role for the right for the stage of company, and how do you evolve that? So we actually have you'll see this across the industry. VCs now have functional roles themselves. They have a chief product officer, a financial head of finance, and we have a head of people strategy. So that's sort of the area that we feel strongly about and we think is unique to us. And so we've actually, where it makes sense, the company can choose to use them on a quarter part-time basis, fractionally, and it's a direct relationship. And there's, the 4 R's set out with them, and then they help out across the portfolio. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot more on that. And I think the trend that maybe your last question, we can take a bit after these next ones, because I think transitioning advisors is a whole topic that we can talk quite a bit about, but I think that's key to figure that out and to do that.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think, Cam, part of the, if I'm understanding your question, the genesis is is there more potential for conflict given the VCs are more operational now? And I think the answer is yes. The good news for the entrepreneur is, good venture funds bring more than capital. We used to talk about, we're not picking winners, we're trying to help make winners. But, so what you do, and Maria's just talked, about some of the things they do. And, I think every venture fund is trying to be of more service to the entrepreneur post-check, which is great. Because, by the way, as a venture fund, you don't make money investing day one anymore. You've got to create value because nobody's buying anything for cheap. So I think those are all positive trends, but it does for sure, I think, bring you more into, if the role of the VC is to be a coach and the management team to be the player, when the VC starts putting players on the field from their fund, you can have conflict. So I think it's just important that the venture fund in particular and the management team understands who's really driving the bus. Like, you know, at the end of the day, everything is done in service of the entrepreneur, right? Like all of us on this call, we're all here to serve the entrepreneur. Not to say there's not accountability and, you know, implications if there's not results, but at the end of the day, we're here. And I think it's important the entrepreneur, especially if they're younger and earlier in their career, you know, that the self-confidence is there to say, hey, listen, thank you, appreciate it, but I'm going to do this because I think it's the right thing for the business. You know, hopefully you're right in making those judgment calls, but I think that distinction's got to be clear and kind of present every day.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And at least from our perspective, we see those that help sort of being the transitional help, because hopefully as they're successful, they're, you know, going to need those functional roles themselves. And you know, if they continue to need us in that way, that might be a sign of, you know, some other issues, right? So that's sort of how we look at it. Justin, do you agree with Rich that the FAST agreements are a good place to start for advisory agreements?
Yeah, I think they are. I think there's always there's always going to be a little bit of a market-based assessment in terms of anytime you're working on standardized docs. Like, we love standardized docs because it encourages entrepreneurs to actually do things properly because they seem accessible and easy and cheaper. And B, you don't waste time on outlier situations or deals, but you always just have to be. You do have to be aware of your local market and local circumstances, and the particulars. Like, advisory can be broad ranging, as we've talked about. But yes, generally speaking, I saw Carl's question, and yeah, I think it's a good idea.
And so there was an earlier question, and you guys have all touched on it. But how do you find advisors, which is a bit tied to, you know, what makes you as a company or as a CEO, entrepreneur compelling for an advisor? Can you comment on both of those? Rich, Cam, Justin?
Sorry, it was the first part, where we find them, and the second part, what makes us valuable? Yeah,
compelling.
Us compelling.
Tell yourself to, so let's say you find them. How do you sell them on you?
How do we sell them on us? Well, I'll take the first part, and then I'll turn the second part over to Cam and Justin. I'm not sure I try to sell myself per se, but anyway, the first part is, you know, how do you find? I think we've talked, you know, incubators, accelerators. A personal plug for BC Tech. Like, I think BC Tech's got an amazing set of programs and services that I'd encourage everybody to plug into. I'm also a mentor, as is Justin and Cam, I think too, as to CDL, which is, you know, like, the world didn't really need another accelerator, but I think they've done an amazing job at catalyzing a mentor community and investor community. And I think it's kind of one of the places along BC Tech to go. Even if you don't get into the program, just kind of banging around and meeting some of the people there is a great place. And then I would also say the venture funds, even if you know, if you're persuasive and persistent and you get in the door, your goal should be to get value out of the meeting if it's not a check, right? And so who else do you know? Who are some of the people you've worked with in this space? What are some of the forward-thinking customers? Like, whatever it is that you want to get out of that meeting. And those are the starting points, I guess.
Yeah, I found that it's been harder. Scaling a tech company is a pretty insular day to day, and it's kind of easy to get put some blinders on and keep head down and just stay in your own world. And so I just encourage people to, you know, I was on the board at BC Tech, and I got a lot of value out of these ecosystems and these events, which sometimes on a rainy Tuesday you think, I'm not going to go. I just go, because you don't know who you're going to run into and who's going to help you go above and beyond to help you out, or have that 10-minute conversation that turns into something really meaningful. So I think we've all been locked in our dens and our basements or wherever we've been for the last couple of years. And it's so nice to, whether it's virtual, and I know it's not the same always, but get out, because there's tons of advisors out there who are interested in these meetings and want to meet scale up companies. And yeah, I know that's pretty basic, but we just need to start interacting more.
Yeah, totally agree on that one, Cam and Rich. And a further plug for BC Tech. Like sometimes if it's not advisors, at least the more mentorship stuff we talked about, including things like the C councils, right? So finding like-minded, similarly situated folks, facing the same problems you're facing. Sounds like maybe that doesn't make sense, because how can they mentor or advise you if they themselves are at a similar stage? But I think there's enough variability, and someone who's just raised $100 million, 6 months earlier might have viewed themselves not as a growth stage company, but after going through the revenue scaling, the fundraising, and the team growth within 12 months, they can actually have a lot to offer, even though they might only be 6 or 12 months ahead of you in terms of what the challenges you're facing in your business. So you don't necessarily have to say everyone has to be a senior statesperson. There can be your peer group that actually can be a good source of mentorship and advisory. And I actually think like a call for a lot of the entrepreneurs, and we've grown some big companies in BC in the last 5 years. And those individual entrepreneurs are also a great pool of mentorship talent. It's not just the VCs or just the professional advisors, it's those folks. And I think they're often ready, willing, and sort of able to get involved, particularly those who have had exits and have some time on their hands.
Great. So maybe please enter any other questions in the chat. We're on the last 5 minutes or so of our session today, but we touched a bit on having to transition advisors. Kind of at the beginning of the discussion, Justin, you talked about often companies maybe bring on a lot of advisors, maybe even put them on the board because they have to, because of us investors early on, and there could be very much a great relationship and a lot of value add at the beginning, but eventually as a company's scale, maybe they needed something else. How do you transition? How do you deal with transitions? Any advice? How maybe a good example of where it's gone well, and another example of how it wasn't handled so well?
Do you want me to respond to that? Or?
Yeah, anyone?
Yeah, I mean, at the board level, what I'd say on that is when you're talking to investors, so one, if it's non-investors, so if you're asking industry folks to join your board, be very clear up front, right? So we're bringing you on the board because of your expertise and what you can offer the business. We fully expect you'll be with us for a couple of years. You're not joining us to be a lifetime board member to take us from startup to exit necessarily, right? You might, but be clear about those expectations so that people don't feel like it's a failure if they're asked to move off, because I think there's a lot of pride involved when you ask a board member to step away. So that's one, is being clear up front. And two, when you're talking to your investors, and this goes for angels or early stage seed funds, I think it's also an important conversation to have with them. So yes, you're going to get a board seat as part of your investment, but what's your philosophy on giving up that board seat if you're not leading our A round or growth stage round? And looking for investors who understanding their philosophy. Some of them might be able to upscale with you, and that's important to them. But I think making sure you have alignment on that too is important. So really, it's around understanding expectations.
Just maybe a couple of things to top up. I think those are all bang on. I read a stat a few years ago. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but let's just pretend it is, that 8% of companies' CEOs, like founders, are still the CEO at exit. So the chances are better than not that you as a founder, assuming most people on this call are, say, early stage founders, you're not going to be the CEO by the time this thing exits, certainly if it goes an IPO route. So the relentless scrutiny of you should be bi-directional. You should be relentlessly scrutinizing your board and your advisors to make sure they're continuing to add value and doing the job. So when those tough conversations come, because they may come the other way, you should be perfectly sort of prepared to have them, and it's perfectly natural. And those evolutions, as more money comes in, or the growth stage is different, or the company pivots into a different vertical, all of which happens all the time. It's just totally natural. It's just business, as they say. And obviously you do, professionally, respectfully, all that stuff. The other tactical thing I'd say is, if you're raising money, and not to say that you have to go the venture route, lots of great companies don't, but if you do, and you happen to raise money from a venture fund or a corporation, or call it a professional entity of some kind, if you can get it, my strong advice would be to say that if the person who is making the initial investment and joining your initial board moves on, which happens all the time, you get a right to approve the next nominee. Now, maybe Justin, you could tell me how often you think you can get that, but I'll give you, there's lots of specific examples. You know, as a corporate investor, person leaves, like I left TELUS, who takes those board seats over? And if it's not somebody experienced, who's empathetic to the CEO's journey, if, you know, it can be a disaster. So if you can get it as a CEO or as a founder, say, yeah, that's great, TELUS, you get a board seat as per the shareholders agreement, but I want to be able to either approve or select the individual who sits in that board seat, because I think that chemistry is critical.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rich. I think, you know, it's always a question of leverage, whether you can do that or not, but I think it's a great objective. And I think the best CEOs that I work with are very deliberate about their board. The composition, the strategy behind the composition, the skills matrix you talked about, Rich, I think, but also the dynamics of the, you know, what different hats people wear, how they operate, what their approaches are. So very deliberate, and don't have long-standing board members just because. So I think that's great if you can get it. That's a great idea.
And yeah, one thing I'd add on the functional advisors is just be mindful of the potential ruffled feathers that some, maybe it's on the business development side or it's on the marketing side to your existing core team. And that the communication of what the intent is with this person, and that they're a resource for everybody, perhaps, or not. But I know when you're in a company and all of a sudden you see the CEO meeting with an advisor who is functionally something you think is your role, you can ruffle some feathers. It can have some cultural impact too, and I don't think advisors typically want to be a negative impact on a company. So just making sure that that's dealt with can help.